Welcome back, everyone. So we love talking about federal court victories for gun owners because what happens in one federal court often, not always, but often eventually has benefit for all of the rest of us. And let me tell you, we had a major victory as gun owners in the Fifth Circuit just a couple of days ago. The case is Reese versus ATF, and it deals with existing federal law. It's 922B subsection 1, in case you're curious, which makes it a crime for somebody 18 through 20 years old to buy a handgun in this country. This has always been extremely insulting to many young Americans because what the law says is, yeah, hey, if you're 18 or 19 or 20, you can go and fight and die for your country, but you can't buy a handgun here in America. Or, yeah, you can go out there and buy a house or rent an apartment or pay taxes. Don't forget to pay your taxes, but you can't buy a handgun. Or, yes, you can get married and you can be a parent at the age of 18 or 19 or 20, but you can't buy a handgun to defend your family. It's always been absolutely absurd. This current law was passed in 1968 by Congress as part of, and wait for this title, it's going to make you gag, as part of the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act. I love it when the government decides the best way to keep us safe is to limit the kind of firearms that we can buy, and in this case, when we can buy them. Thankfully, hopefully, this is about to be struck down nationwide. This case began in December of 2022, so a few months after the Bruin decision came down in June of that year. And it stems around some young adults who were over 18 or 18 or above, but not 21, who wanted to buy a handgun, but were told they could not by existing federal law. As is often the case, the district court judge, that's the lowest level in the federal court structure, disagreed with their arguments, and he ended their lawsuit. But of course, they appealed this to a 3-judge panel with the Fifth Circuit, and in November of 2023, they had their day in court for oral arguments, and they won a massive victory just last week. Now, I want to do a little rabbit trail here on the pace of the federal court process. This case, like I just said, it was argued in November of 23, not November of 24. And so it took the court 14 or close to 15 months to hand down this decision. And people ask me a lot, because we're in court a lot, how can we speed this up? And the answer is you really can't. You really can't. You can do emergency appeals in certain situations, but this case would not be considered an emergency. But for the most part, it is very hard to speed up anything in the federal courts. We have to pretty much just get used to it. So sorry about that. So when it comes to gun rights cases, the courts have different prongs they have to consider about whether or not a law is constitutional. The first prong in that test is, does the Second Amendment cover the conduct at issue? So if it doesn't cover it, then the government can regulate it. That's the short version. So does the Second Amendment cover the conduct at issue? In this case, does it cover 18, 19, and 20-year-olds who want to buy a gun? Now, here's where I'm going to give you some arguments from the Department of Injustice. And some of these will make you laugh. Some of these will make you probably boil with rage. But don't worry, because we win in the end on this one. First, the DOJ, with a straight face, argued in this case the Second Amendment does not cover the actual purchasing of a firearm. I'm going to say that again. The DOJ literally said the Second Amendment covers your right to keep a firearm, and you can bear a firearm, but it doesn't say you can purchase a firearm. So their contention was nothing else matters because that's not constitutional. Thankfully, the Fifth Circuit laughed this crap out of court. They said, of course, the words purchase, sale, or similar terms describing a transaction do not appear in the Second Amendment. But the right to keep and bear arms surely implies the right to purchase them in the first place. So that argument was a swing and a miss. The government comes back then and says, okay, so yeah, fine, it covers the right to buy, but it does not cover the right for young adults, 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, specifically to buy a firearm. And the court also rejected this as well. It says, because constitutional rights impliedly protect the corollary act to purchase them, We believe that it does. To suggest otherwise proposes where a citizen's constitutional right to keep and bear arms excludes the most prevalent, accessible, and safe market used to exercise that right. What does that mean? It's very simple. They're saying they have the right to buy them, and to say otherwise means that they have a right in theory, but not in practice. So thankfully, the DOJ lost that argument as well. Then these imbeciles come back, the DOJ lawyers come back, and they say, okay, fine. We're going to contend that Americans aged 18, 19, and 20 are not part of the people referenced in the Second Amendment. So when the amendment says the right of the people to keep and bear arms, that applies to people who are 21 or above. That's what they said. And they hung that argument on the fact, they said, that in the 1700s, 21 was the age of maturity. And so if they won that one, again, they win the entire argument. But the court, again, laughed them out of the courtroom and said, the operative clause of the Second Amendment states the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. There are no age or maturity restrictions in the plain text of the Second Amendment, as there are in other constitutional provisions. This suggests the Second Amendment lacks a minimum age requirement. So the court said, no, you show us in the text. Where is there an age limiter in the Second Amendment? There isn't one. And so your argument is crap. The same thing applied to the government's next argument. See, these people never quit. See, don't forget, you and I pay their salaries, so they don't really care how dumb their arguments are. And they work for the government, so they don't care if they win or actually lose. You know, if they were a lawyer in a private law firm and they lost every single time, they would eventually get fired. But under Joe Biden and Merrick Garland, their DEI hires, they just didn't care. Now, maybe under President Trump and the new Attorney General, maybe Pam Bondi, we'll have to wait and see. Maybe that's different. But for the last couple of years, they didn't care how much of our money was wasted in these cases. So their next argument was that because the right to vote from the time of America's founding to the 26th Amendment was reserved for citizens over 21 years of age, we believe that that should be the case when it comes to buying firearms. Again, the Fifth Circuit heavily disagreed. They came back and smashed us out of the park, and they said, this argument is incompatible with Second Amendment precedent. It's nonsensical when considered against the backdrop of American suffrage, and it's contradicted by the history of firearms use at the time of our nation's founding. Yes, sometimes I would just love to be a fly in the wall in their chambers because, you know, sometimes you win a gun case, it's kind of a squeaker. You know, it wasn't a major victory. You won, but it wasn't that much of a precedent. That's not what this is. The court in this case brutalized the DOJ lawyers who tried to make one stupid argument after the next. And we're certainly happy to applaud that here. So the DOJ lost the first test, which is, does the Constitution cover the action or the conduct in question? The second prong then of the test is, does America's history support the regulation in question? Is there an historical precedent or analog that is substantively similar to the gun control law on the books today? And so here, the DOJ goes back into the history of our country, and they're looking for examples where Americans were restricted in their right to buy handguns between the age of 18 through 20. And you're not going to believe the absurdity of some of these examples. The first one they had was a case or policies from the University of Georgia and the University of Virginia who barred firearms amongst people on campus back in the late 1700s. And so they held this up as a shiny example of historical precedent, but it's not. And the court knew that, and they said, no. They said these policies banned all students from possessing firearms on campus, not just those who were 18 through 20. And the policy banned all guns, not handguns specifically. As a result, they did not take that argument at all. The next argument comes all the way back from 1755, and it comes from the Keystone State, Pennsylvania. And the DOJ argued that because Pennsylvania's 1755 Militia Act only allowed individuals to join the militia if they were under 21 with parental consent. By extension, they have the right to ban Americans today from buying handguns unless they're 21. The court was brutal in their response to this argument because it was an absolute lie. First, they said that Pennsylvania came back and lowered their own ordinance, their own militia act in 1777 from 21 to 18. And of course they did, because America was then in a fight with the British Crown in 1777. But they went on to say, even when it was in effect at the age of 21, that only limited when an American could join the government, could serve, in this case, in the military. Nowhere in that act did it say that somebody who was 18, 19, or 20 could not buy a handgun at that time. So another straightforward lie from the federal government. The next argument, you're going to love this one. The next argument was from 1810 in South Carolina. And what the DOJ had here was documents from either state or county government at that time that prevented anyone under the age of 21 from becoming a constable. Today, we call them a sheriff, for example. And so the DOJ says, aha, they couldn't be a constable when they were 21. And so therefore that backstops our gun control law today. And the court in this case, you could almost see them roll their eyes. They said, does that have anything to do with buying with buying guns? No, it doesn't. And they said, and even if you can try to claim that it is, it's the same answer as it was in the Pennsylvania case. This only limits when a person can work for the government, in this case as a constable. Nowhere in this ordinance in 1810 did South Carolina say that a person who lives in that state, 18 through 20, could not buy a gun. In other words, it limited the government employment aspects of a person, not their right of self-defense. So that was a huge swing and a miss. The last argument from the DOJ was wrapped around the Rahimi case from the Supreme Court from last year. The Rahimi case modified or further defined the Bruen case from 2022. The Rahimi case dealt with a person who had abused his domestic partner. I don't know if they were married or not. I don't even know. And the guy had shot a whole bunch of people as well. He was a violent criminal. And the case that in Rahimi was whether or not there was an historic precedent or a need for historic precedent to take guns away from somebody who was pending these types of violent criminal charges. In the case of Rahimi, the government said there is no need for that type of analog, and they were allowed to enforce a gun restriction on this person. So in this case, the DOJ says, well, you see, you allowed for this in Rahimi, so why can't we restrict guns amongst people today who are under 21? They said specifically, the Rahimi case from last year gives the government, quote, broader authority to restrict arms bearing by categories of persons that present a special danger of misuse. And it did. Rahimi dealt with a person or persons who had violently harmed other people. To try to apply that as a broad category to every 18, 19, and 20-year-old is absolutely stupid at best and nefarious at worst. In this case, the court agreed. They said this, quote, misstates Rahimi, which added that those laws apply only once a court has found that the defendant represents a credible threat to the physical safety of another person. The government's contention in this case is meritless. In other words, yeah, that was a violent person. You're talking about every single American who was 18 through 20. That's not what the Rahimi case was about. So you got to give them credit. You know, Merrick Garland, the DOJ, they hate freedom and the Second Amendment so much. They did all they could to win this case, and they got destroyed. The conclusion of the court, it reads like gold. It says, ultimately, the text of the Second Amendment includes 18 to 20-year-old individuals amongst the people whose right to keep and bear arms is protected under the amendment. The federal government has presented scant evidence that 18 to 20-year-olds' firearms rights during our nation's founding were restricted in any similar manner to the contemporary federal handgun purchase ban. And its 19th century evidence cannot provide much insight into the meaning of the Second Amendment when it contradicts earlier evidence. In sum, 922B and their attendant regulations are unconstitutional in light of our nation's historic tradition of firearms regulation. This, my friends, is a huge victory. This is a big one. Now, coming up, the DOJ could appeal this to the larger court. That could happen. But we have a new DOJ, and we're going to have a new attorney general. We have a new president, and they're going to get their marching orders from that president, not from Joe Biden. So we'll see what happens. Guys, we're going to have a lot more of this coming up. President Trump is back in the White House. There's going to be a lot of additional judges added to the federal bench. We're going to have victories coming for a long time. Hey guys, IFC is fighting hard to expand Second Amendment freedom to ensure our children's children have a right to keep and bear arms. Get involved in this fight today. First, follow us on Twitter. Second, sign up for text alerts from us. And number 3, like and subscribe for more content.